In her perfect Chicago apartment, a meticulous 28-year-old was about to discover a devastating truth. What started as a routine family reunion planning call took a shocking turn when she came face to face with 8 minutes of brutal honesty. Sarah Chen-Williams wasn't your typical marketing coordinator. For 25 years, she had spent her life perfecting the art of family harmony, known for her color-coded spreadsheets and desperate need for approval. When she encountered a forgotten phone call still running, she had no idea she was walking into the most devastating conversation of her life. Sarah listened in horror as her cousin Jake, Uncle Tom, and Aunt Linda spent 8 minutes casually destroying everything she believed about her place in the Williams family. What began as morning coffee and reunion preparations would become a complete unraveling of performed love. The Williams family would never be the same after Sarah finally stopped apologizing for taking up space. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Chen-Williams stood at her kitchen counter at 6:47 a.m., her laptop open to a color-coded spreadsheet titled Williams Family Reunion 2025. The document contained 3 tabs: logistics, food assignments, and contact information. Each cell meticulously filled with the kind of detail that had earned her a reputation as the family's unofficial event coordinator. She sipped her coffee from a mug that read, "World's Best Daughter," and smiled at the irony. She'd bought it for herself last Christmas. The apartment around her reflected the same careful attention to detail. Every surface gleamed, every pillow sat at the perfect angle, and the gallery wall of family photos told a story of belonging that Sarah had spent 25 years constructing. There she was at age 5, gap-toothed and grinning between her adoptive parents at a Christmas morning that looked like it belonged in a greeting card. There was last year's reunion, where she'd organized games for the kids and coordinated the potluck with military precision. In every photo, her smile was just a fraction too bright, her posture just a touch too perfect. She glanced at the clock on her laptop screen. Jake would call any minute. He always called exactly at 7, a habit she'd noticed and appreciated, because it showed he respected her schedule. Sarah straightened the papers beside her laptop, printed emails confirming the rental pavilion, a hand-drawn map of the park with optimal parking highlighted in yellow, and a list of dietary restrictions. She'd compiled after calling each family member personally. The marketing campaigns she managed at work required less organization than this reunion. Her phone buzzed, and Jake's name appeared on the screen. Sarah's shoulders relaxed as she answered, her voice carrying the warm enthusiasm she'd perfected over years of family interactions. "Morning, Jake. Perfect timing as always. I just finished going through the final head count." "Hey, Sarah." His voice sounded slightly muffled, like he was driving or multitasking. "Thanks for getting up early for this. I know you're busy with work and everything." Sarah felt the familiar flutter of validation. Jake noticed her sacrifices. "No problem. At all. Family comes first, right? Besides, I love doing this stuff." The words came easily because she'd convinced herself they were true. "So I've got some updates from Aunt Linda about the dessert table, and I wanted to run through the setup timeline one more time." She could hear Jake shuffling papers, or maybe it was the sound of traffic. "Sure, yeah. Whatever you think is best. You're the expert at this stuff." The comment warmed her more than it should have. Sarah opened her notes app and began reading from her carefully prepared agenda. "Okay, so Uncle Tom confirmed he's bringing the grills, but I'm thinking we should have backup propane just in case. I can pick that up. And your mom wants to know if we need more folding chairs. I think yes, because if the weather's nice, we'll have the Hendersons and the Martinez cousins from Indiana." Jake's responses came at regular intervals, the kind of engaged but distant acknowledgments that Sarah had learned to interpret as approval. She'd become an expert at reading the emotional temperature of conversations, always calibrating her enthusiasm to match what others seemed to want from her. "I also thought we could do the group photo earlier this year, maybe around 2 o'clock. Last time we waited until sunset and half the kids were melting down. Plus the lighting would be better for your mom's camera." "Good thinking. You always think of everything." Sarah's chest tightened with pleasure. This was why she did it. The moments when family members acknowledged how hard she worked, how much she cared, how essential she was to keeping everyone connected. Oh, and I made those recipe cards you suggested. The ones with your grandmother's potato salad recipe. I had them printed on cardstock so people can take them home. Recipe cards? Jake sounded confused. Remember? At Easter, you mentioned how sad it was that some of the family recipes might get lost when the older generation. Sarah trailed off, uncertainty creeping into her voice. You said it would be nice to preserve them? Oh, right. Yeah, that's good. The pause felt longer than it should have. Sarah filled it quickly, the way she always did when conversations felt like they might be veering toward awkwardness. I thought we could display them next to the dessert table. Very casual, but people can grab them if they want. I made extras. You really do think of everything. Jake's voice carried what Sarah interpreted as affection, though there was something else underneath it. A note she couldn't quite identify. Fatigue, maybe. The stress of planning his upcoming wedding. It's no trouble. I actually enjoy it. There's something nice about knowing I can help bring everyone together. Sarah realized how that sounded. A little too earnest, a little too needy, and quickly shifted gears. Plus, it gives me an excuse to practice my project management skills outside of work. Right. The marketing thing. The way he said, the marketing thing, made Sarah's smile falter slightly. But Jake had never been particularly interested in her career. The Williams family was built around Tom's construction business. Real work, physical work, work that built things people could see and touch. Marketing was abstract, something that happened on computers and in conference rooms. Sarah had learned not to talk about her campaigns or her small victories at the agency. Anyway, she continued, I think we're in good shape. I'll be there early to set up, obviously. Probably around 10:30 to make sure everything's ready before people start arriving. You don't have to do all that yourself. I'm sure people can help. But Sarah knew better. She'd learned over the years that volunteering to handle everything up front was easier than trying to coordinate help from family members who had their own ideas about timing and organization. I really don't mind. Besides, I have it down to a science now. She heard what sounded like Jake putting his phone down, then picking it up again. Sorry, just grabbing my coffee. So you think we're all set then? I think so. Unless there's anything specific you're worried about? Nah, you've got it covered. You always do. There it was again. That note in his voice that Sarah couldn't quite place. But she chose to focus on the compliment instead of the uncertainty. Well, it's going to be great. The weather forecast looks perfect, and I think having it at the same park as last year will make it easier for everyone, especially with the grandparents. True. Okay. I should probably get going. Early meeting today. Of course. Thanks for calling to check in. I know you're swamped with wedding planning and work and everything. Yeah, it's been crazy. But this reunion stuff is important too. Sarah felt a warm glow of purpose. I'm just happy I can help. That's what family's for, right? Right. Okay, I'll talk to you later, Sarah. Thanks for handling all this. Love you too, Sarah said automatically, though Jake had already hung up. She set the phone down and looked at her reunion planning materials with satisfaction. The conversation had gone well. Jake seemed pleased with her preparation, and she'd managed to cover all the important points without overwhelming him with details. She'd struck the right balance between competent and accommodating, the sweet spot she'd been perfecting since childhood. Sarah closed her laptop and began gathering her work materials for the day. She had a client presentation at 9 and 3 meetings back-to-back in the afternoon, but her mind was already jumping ahead to reunion tasks. She could stop by the party store during lunch to pick up the backup propane and some extra serving utensils. Maybe swing by the grocery store too, just to grab a few more cases of water. The familiar rhythm of over-preparation calmed her in a way that nothing else could. When everything was organized, when every detail was anticipated, when every family member's needs were met before they even knew they had them. That's when Sarah felt most like herself, most like she belonged. She glanced once more at the family photos on her wall, her eyes lingering on a picture from 2 years ago, where she stood between Uncle Tom and Jake, all three of them laughing at something just outside the frame. Sarah remembered that moment. She'd told a joke about her marketing boss that had actually landed. For just a few minutes, she'd felt like one of them. Really, truly, one of them. That's what made all the planning and coordination worth it. Those moments when the careful choreography of family harmony worked exactly as intended, when her efforts created the space for genuine connection. Sarah smoothed her skirt and grabbed her keys, already mentally rehearsing her presentation while simultaneously calculating whether she had enough time to call the park district and confirm their pavilion reservation. The phone sat silent on her counter. The call ended, the connection severed. Or so she thought. Sarah had just reached for her purse when Jake's voice cut through the silence of her apartment. "Jake!" she called out, confusion threading through her voice as she looked at her phone. The call had ended. She'd watched the screen go dark, but his voice was still there, tinny and distant, coming from the device she'd set on the counter. She picked up the phone, and her heart stuttered. The call timer was still running. 2 minutes and 37 seconds. 2 minutes and 38. Jake hadn't hung up properly. "Jake, are you there?" she said into the phone. But his voice continued, and she realized with dawning comprehension that he wasn't talking to her anymore. Finally got off the phone with Sarah. Jake's voice carried the particular tone people used when they thought no one was listening. Casual, unguarded. "Jesus, Dad, I swear she gets more intense about this reunion stuff every year." Sarah's hand froze halfway to her mouth. Another voice came through the speaker, deeper, familiar. "Uncle Tom. Tell me about it. Woman sent me 3 emails about grilling logistics. 3, for hamburgers and hot dogs." Uncle Tom's laugh had an edge to it that Sarah had never heard before. "I've been grilling for 40 years, but apparently I need step-by-step instructions now." The apartment seemed to tilt around Sarah. She sank into the kitchen chair she'd just vacated, the phone clutched in suddenly sweaty hands. "She means..." "Well," Jake said, but there was something in his voice, a hesitation that made Sarah's stomach clench. "I think..." "Does she, though?" Uncle Tom's voice carried the authority that had always made Sarah straighten her shoulders and try harder to impress him. "Sometimes I wonder if all this enthusiasm is just her way of making herself indispensable. Like she's trying to buy her way into the family." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Buy her way into the family. As if she were some kind of imposter who had to earn her place through perfect potato salad coordination and color-coded spreadsheets. "That's harsh, Dad." But Jake didn't sound shocked. He sounded like he was considering it. "Is it? Look, I'm not saying she's not family. Of course she is. But there's something desperate about it, you know. The way she volunteers for everything, takes over everything. Remember last year when she reorganized Mom's entire buffet table while Mom was in the bathroom? Sarah remembered that moment differently. Aunt Linda had been stressed about the food getting cold, and Sarah had simply helped by moving the warming trays to maintain temperature. She'd thought she was being helpful. "And don't get me started on those damn recipe cards she mentioned," Uncle Tom continued. "My mother's potato salad recipe? Sarah doesn't even eat potatoes. She's always going on about her gluten-free, dairy-free whatever. But she wants to preserve our family recipes? To be fair, she might want them for..." Jake started. "For what?" "She's not going to have kids to pass them down to." Marcus was smart to get out when he did. The casual cruelty of the statement left Sarah breathless. Marcus, her ex-boyfriend, who had ended their relationship 6 months ago with words about prioritizing family approval over authentic connection. Words she'd dismissed as unfair at the time. "Marcus said something to me once," Jake's voice carried, a note of reluctant confession. "At that barbecue last summer, he said dating Sarah was like competing with a ghost family for her attention. Said she cared more about what we thought than what he thought. Smart man, though I never understood what he saw in her in the first place." Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. These were the people she'd spent 25 years trying to please. The people whose approval she'd chased through every holiday, every birthday, every carefully orchestrated family gathering. A third voice joined the conversation, lighter, more musical. "Aunt Linda. Are you two gossiping about poor Sarah again?" But her tone was amused, not protective. "Just trying to figure out how to handle the reunion without hurting her feelings," Uncle Tom said. She's already appointed herself director of operations. Well, she does take it seriously. Maybe too seriously. Aunt Linda's voice carried the kind of fond exasperation usually reserved for discussing difficult children. Did you see what she wore to Easter? That dress probably cost more than my car payment. Who is she trying to impress? That's what I mean, Uncle Tom said. Always trying too hard. Always performing. Performing. The word landed like a slap. Is that what they saw when they looked at her? A performance? She's not exactly... Jake paused, searching for words. I mean, she tries, but she doesn't really get us, you know? Like she'll show up to family events with some fancy appetizer she found on Pinterest, and it's obvious she spent hours making these little perfect things. But they're not. They're not us. They're what she thinks we should want. Remember her sushi phase? Aunt Linda laughed. Brought California rolls to the 4th of July barbecue. California rolls to a barbecue. Or when she tried to get everyone to do that. Gratitude circle at Thanksgiving? Uncle Tom's voice dripped with remembered embarrassment. We're trying to watch football, and she wants us to hold hands and share feelings. Sarah remembered that Thanksgiving differently too. She'd read an article about family traditions that strengthen bonds, and she'd thought it might be nice to try something new. The awkward silence that had followed her suggestion had lasted exactly 12 seconds. She'd counted, before Uncle Tom had made a joke about the game starting soon. The thing is, Jake said, and his voice took on the tone he used when he was about to deliver an uncomfortable truth. I don't think she understands that we love her, but we don't need her to work so hard at it, like she's family. She doesn't have to prove it constantly. But that's just it, Uncle Tom said. She does think she has to prove it, and honestly, sometimes I wonder if she's right. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah found herself holding her breath, waiting for Jake to contradict his father, to defend her, to say something, anything, that would restore the world to its previous shape. Instead, Jake sighed. I know what you mean. Sometimes, when I'm talking to her, I feel like I'm talking to someone who's trying to guess the right answers instead of just being herself. Because she doesn't know how to be herself around us, Aunt Linda said with surprising insight. She's been performing the role of grateful adopted daughter for so long, I'm not sure any of us know who she really is underneath all that trying. Maybe that's on us too, Jake said quietly. How do you figure? Uncle Tom asked. I don't know. Maybe we made her feel like she had to earn it. Like being adopted meant she was on probation or something. Oh, come on. Uncle Tom's voice sharpened. We never treated her differently. She's always been family. But Sarah could hear the defensiveness in his tone, the way people sounded when they were trying to convince themselves as much as others. I'm just saying, Jake continued. Sometimes I watch her at these family things, and she looks exhausted, like she's working really hard at something that should be easy. Well, maybe that's because it's not easy for her, Aunt Linda said. Maybe it never has been. What do you mean? Jake asked. I mean she looks nothing like any of us. She has different interests, different values, different ways of seeing the world. Maybe all this organizing and volunteering is her way of trying to create connection where it doesn't come naturally. Sarah stared at the family photos on her wall through tear-blurred eyes. In every single one, she was the only face that didn't quite fit the pattern, the only black hair in a sea of brown and blonde, the only eyes that turned up at the corners, the only one whose smile looked like it was working too hard. So what are we supposed to do? Jake asked. Just pretend we don't notice how weird it gets sometimes? I don't know, Uncle Tom said. But I'm tired of walking on eggshells every time we have a family event. Tired of having to be grateful for things I didn't ask for. Last reunion, she spent the entire day taking pictures and organizing games and managing everyone's food allergies like we were all invalids. She just wants to help, Jake said, but his defense sounded half-hearted. Does she? Or does she want to be needed? The question hung in the air, and Sarah realized with devastating clarity that she didn't know the answer. Had she ever helped her family because they needed help? Or had she created needs where none existed, manufactured crises she could solve, orchestrated complications that required her intervention? Anyway, Uncle Tom said, I should get going. Conference call in 10 minutes. Just try to manage her at the reunion, okay? Maybe redirect some of that energy so the rest of us can actually relax and enjoy ourselves. Yeah, Jake said. I'll handle Sarah. Handle Sarah. Like she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. Sarah heard the sound of movement, chairs scraping, footsteps. Then Jake's voice, closer to the phone now. Dad, do you ever feel bad about it? About the way we talk about her? A pause. Then Uncle Tom's voice, quiet but clear. I feel bad that she makes us feel like we need to talk about her at all. The line went dead. Sarah sat in her perfect kitchen, surrounded by her perfect planning materials, staring at her perfect family, photos, and felt something fundamental crack inside her chest. Not break, not yet, but crack, like ice under pressure, creating fissures that would soon become chasms. 25 years of carefully constructed belonging had just revealed itself to be an elaborate, exhausting performance that no one had asked for and everyone had noticed. She'd spent her entire adult life trying to earn a place in a family that saw her efforts as evidence of her difference rather than proof of her love. The worst part wasn't the cruelty, it was the casual nature of it. The way they'd discussed her desperate attempts at connection, like they were discussing the weather, with mild annoyance and resigned acceptance. Like her pain was an inconvenience they'd learned to tolerate. Sarah looked at her phone, still showing the call duration. 8 minutes and 43 seconds. 8 minutes and 43 seconds of truth that had destroyed a lifetime of carefully maintained illusions. She set the phone down with trembling hands and stared at her reunion planning materials. The color-coded spreadsheets, the backup propane she'd planned to buy, the recipe cards she'd had printed on cardstock because she thought preserving family traditions would make her more family. All of it suddenly looked like what it was. The desperate artifacts of someone trying to purchase love with perfect organization. Sarah remained frozen in her kitchen chair for 17 minutes after the call ended. She knew this because she watched the digital clock on her microwave tick forward, each minute bringing her further away from the moment when her world made sense. Her coffee grew cold in the world's best daughter mug. The morning light shifted across her carefully arranged family photos, illuminating smiles that now looked forced, her own most of all. When she finally moved, it was to reach for her phone with hands that shook just slightly. She opened her recent calls and stared at Jake's name, at the 8 minutes and 43 seconds that had unraveled 25 years of carefully constructed belonging. Part of her wanted to call him back, to confront him, to demand an explanation or an apology. But a larger part of her, the part that had spent a lifetime reading emotional temperatures and adjusting accordingly, knew that Jake had said exactly what he meant. They all had. The apartment felt different now. Not smaller, exactly, but exposed. Like someone had removed a filter she hadn't known she was looking through. Sarah stood on unsteady legs and walked to her gallery wall, studying each photo with new eyes. There she was at 8, gap-toothed and beaming between Maggie and David at her first Williams family Christmas. She remembered that day. How carefully she'd chosen her outfit. How she'd practiced saying thank you for each gift. How she'd been so determined to be the perfect, grateful daughter. In the photo, her smile was wide and genuine. But now, she could see the tension in her small shoulders, the way she was leaning just slightly away from the camera, as if part of her was already preparing to prove she deserved to be in the frame. Next to it hung a photo from her high school graduation. Uncle Tom's arm was around her shoulders, and she remembered feeling so proud that he'd driven 3 hours to see her speak as valedictorian. But looking at it now, she could see the subtle distance between them, the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Had he been proud? Or had he been performing his own version of family love, just as carefully choreographed as hers? Maybe all this organizing and volunteering is her way of trying to create connection where it doesn't come naturally. Aunt Linda's words echoed in her mind, and Sarah felt something twist in her stomach. Connection that didn't come naturally. Is that what she'd been doing all these years? Manufacturing intimacy through perfectly executed logistics? She moved to her laptop and opened the reunion planning spreadsheet. 3 tabs of meticulous organization. Contact information for 37 family members, including dietary restrictions she'd gathered through individual phone calls. A timeline. For setup that accounted for wind patterns and optimal sun exposure. Backup plans for rain, for equipment failure, for food allergies. When had this become her identity? When had she transformed from Sarah, who happened to be good at organizing, into Sarah, whose value to the family depended entirely on her ability to orchestrate their gatherings? The answer came to her with uncomfortable clarity. The summer she turned 16. That was the year she'd overheard a different conversation. Uncle Tom and Aunt Linda discussing college plans with Jake. The easy assumption that he'd join the family construction business. The casual mentions of his future role. The way they talked about his life as if it were already mapped out and welcomed. Sarah had been standing in the kitchen doorway, forgotten and invisible, listening to a discussion about belonging that would never include her. That was the night she'd started planning her first family event. A surprise birthday party for David that had taken her 3 weeks to organize. The gratitude on his face, the way Maggie had hugged her and called her thoughtful, the way Uncle Tom had clapped her on the shoulder and said she'd done good work. It had felt like finding a key to a door she'd been trying to open her entire life. So she'd kept planning, kept organizing, kept creating reasons for them to appreciate her, to need her, to include her in their careful family choreography. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her boss. "Ready for the Hartley presentation this morning? Know you'll knock it out of the park as always." The Hartley presentation. Sarah stared at the message, trying to remember what she was supposed to be presenting. Something about brand recognition and target demographics. Numbers and charts and strategic recommendations that felt completely divorced from the chaos in her chest. She called in sick. It was the first time in 3 years she'd missed work for anything other than a family obligation. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd used all her personal time accommodating family events and emergencies, but she'd never once prioritized her own emotional crisis over professional responsibilities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With nowhere to go and nothing to distract her, Sarah found herself replaying the overheard conversation, word by word, tone by tone. Each repetition made the words more real, more devastating. She began to see patterns she'd ignored, moments she'd misinterpreted, signals she'd missed entirely. The way conversations sometimes stopped when she entered a room, then resumed with careful inclusivity that felt rehearsed. The way Uncle Tom's praise always came with subtle corrections. "Good job on the reunion, Sarah, though next time we might want to keep it simpler." The way Jake had started calling less frequently over the past year, their conversations becoming shorter and more perfunctory. The way Marcus had tried, gently and then not so gently, to point out that she seemed anxious before every family gathering, that she worked herself into exhaustion, trying to anticipate everyone's needs. "You love them more than they love you," Marcus had said during one of their last arguments. "And you're killing yourself trying to make that equation balance." She'd been furious with him then. How dare he question her family relationships? How dare he suggest that her love wasn't returned in equal measure? Now she wondered if he'd been trying to save her from exactly this moment. Sarah walked to her bathroom and caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked pale, hollow-eyed, like someone recovering from a long illness. But what struck her most was how familiar this expression was. She'd seen it before, in photos from family gatherings where she'd spent days preparing and hours executing perfect events, only to drive home feeling strangely empty despite the success. She'd attributed that emptiness to exhaustion. Now, she wondered if it had been something else entirely. The bone-deep fatigue of performing love instead of simply being loved. Her phone rang. Maggie's name appeared on the screen, and Sarah's heart lurched. Did her adoptive mother know about the conversation? Was this a damage control call? "Hi, Mom," Sarah answered, her voice carefully neutral. "Sweetheart, I just wanted to check about the reunion next weekend. Linda mentioned you've been working so hard on the planning, and I wanted to make sure you're not overdoing it." Sarah closed her eyes. Even now, even after everything she'd heard, her first instinct was to reassure, to downplay, to make sure Maggie didn't worry. "I'm fine," she said automatically. "Everything's under control." "I know it is, honey. You always take such good care of everyone. But you know we'd love you just as much if you showed up empty-handed, right? The words were kind, meant to be comforting. But all Sarah could hear was the implication that her worth to the family was tied to what she brought, what she organized, what she contributed. Would they love her just as much if she showed up empty-handed? Or would they love, "I just like helping. I know you do. You've got such a giving heart. Sometimes I worry you give too much." After the call ended, Sarah sat in her living room and looked around at the evidence of her giving heart. The reunion materials spread across her coffee table. The calendar on her wall marked with family birthdays, anniversaries, and important events. The shelf of photo albums documenting every family gathering she'd attended, organized, or contributed to over the past decade. She'd built an entire identity around being useful to people who found her usefulness mildly annoying. The thought came suddenly and landed with devastating clarity. What if she stopped? What if she didn't buy the backup propane or call to confirm the pavilion reservation? What if she showed up to the reunion without a spreadsheet or a timeline, or a single organized thought? What if she simply arrived, like everyone else, expecting to be welcomed rather than working to earn her welcome? Would they miss her contributions? Or would they be relieved to have one less person trying so hard to prove she belonged? Sarah opened her laptop and stared at the reunion spreadsheet. 3 tabs of careful planning, hours of coordination, a blueprint for another perfectly executed family gathering, where she would spend the entire day managing details and monitoring everyone's happiness while forgetting to pay attention to her own. She closed the laptop without saving her changes. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah Chen-Williams sat in her perfect apartment and did absolutely nothing to prepare for a family event. She didn't call to confirm reservations, or pick up backup supplies, or coordinate with other family members about logistics. Instead, she sat in the growing afternoon shadows and wondered who she might be if she stopped working so hard to earn love that should have been freely given. Who she might become if she had the courage to find out whether her family would choose her without the careful choreography she'd been performing for 25 years. The silence in her apartment felt different now, not peaceful, but pregnant with possibility. For the first time since she was 3 years old, Sarah was about to discover what it felt like to show up to her family as simply herself, without the armor of perfect preparation or the currency of indispensable usefulness. The thought terrified her almost as much as it thrilled her. Outside her window, Chicago moved forward with its usual purposeful energy. People heading to work, to meetings, to lives that didn't require constant justification or performance. Sarah watched them and wondered what it would feel like to move through the world with that kind of confidence. The confidence that came from knowing you belonged somewhere simply because you existed, not because you'd earned your place through perfect execution of thankless tasks. Soon, she would find out. But first, she had to decide whether she had the courage to stop performing and start living. Whether she was ready to discover if the love she'd been chasing for 25 years was real enough to survive without the elaborate costumes she'd worn while pursuing it. The reunion was in 8 days. 8 days to decide who she wanted to be when she walked into that pavilion. 8 days to choose between the comfortable familiarity of performed belonging and the terrifying uncertainty of authentic presence. Sarah looked at her phone, at Jake's name in her recent calls, at the 8 minutes and 43 seconds that had changed everything. For the first time in her life, she had no plan. By Thursday evening, Sarah's carefully controlled world had completely unraveled. She'd spent 3 days in a state of suspended animation, calling in sick to work, ignoring texts from family members, and staring at her reunion planning materials like artifacts from someone else's life. The silence in her apartment had become oppressive, filled with the echoes of Jake's casual cruelty and her own mounting questions about everything she'd believed about herself and her place in the Williams family. When she finally picked up her phone to call Elena, her hands were trembling. "I need to see you," Sarah said without preamble when Elena answered. "Can I come over?" Elena Rodriguez had been Sarah's anchor since their sophomore year at Northwestern, when they'd been randomly assigned as roommates and discovered an unlikely friendship between Sarah's anxious perfectionism and Elena's fierce loyalty. Elena came from a sprawling Latino family where love was loud and arguments were louder, where belonging was assumed rather than earned, and where no one had to perform gratitude for their place at the table. "Of course, mija," You sound terrible. What happened? I can't. I can't talk about it over the phone. Can I come now? Get over here. I'll make tea and order Thai food. Elena's apartment in Wicker Park was everything Sarah's wasn't. Warm. Chaos instead of sterile perfection. Mismatched furniture that told stories instead of matching sets that photographed well. Books were stacked on every surface. Plants in various states of health crowded the windowsills, and the walls were covered with photos where people laughed with their whole bodies instead of posing with careful smiles. Elena took one look at Sarah standing in her doorway, hollow-eyed, still wearing the same clothes from 3 days ago, and pulled her into the kind of fierce hug that Sarah's family had never been comfortable with. Jesus, Sarah. You look like someone died. Something did, Sarah whispered against Elena's shoulder, and the words broke something loose in her chest. She started crying. Not the careful, contained tears she'd learned to cry silently in bathrooms, during family gatherings, but ugly, desperate sobs that came from somewhere deep and previously untouchable. Elena guided her to the couch, poured wine instead of tea, and waited. She'd learned over the years that Sarah needed time to organize her thoughts before she could speak them, even in crisis. Especially in crisis. When Sarah finally lifted her head from Elena's shoulder, her voice came out raw and unfamiliar. I overheard a conversation. About me. My family talking about me when they thought I couldn't hear. What kind of conversation? Sarah told her everything. Every word she could remember from Jake's phone call, every cruel observation, every casual dismissal. Elena's expression grew darker with each revelation, her jaw tightening in the way it did when she was furious, but trying to stay calm for Sarah's sake. Those fucking assholes, Elena said when Sarah finished. Those absolute fucking assholes. The vehemence in her voice startled Sarah. Elena, no, don't you dare defend them. Don't you dare make excuses for that bullshit. Elena stood up and started pacing, her wine glass forgotten. Do you know how many times I've wanted to say something? How many family gatherings I've watched you kill yourself trying to make perfect while they barely acknowledged your existence? Sarah stared at her best friend. What do you mean? I mean I've been watching this train wreck for 8 years. Sarah. 8 years of watching you exhaust yourself trying to earn love from people who act like your effort is an inconvenience. That's not. They don't act like that. Elena stopped pacing and turned to face her, and Sarah saw something in her expression she'd never seen before. A kind of protective fury that made her look dangerous. Remember your birthday 2 years ago? When you threw that dinner party and spent 3 days making homemade pasta and researching wine pairings because you wanted to impress Uncle Tom? Sarah remembered. She'd been so proud of that dinner, so pleased when Tom had complimented the food. He spent the entire evening talking about Jake's promotion and asked you exactly 2 questions. What you did for work, which he forgot the answer to, and whether you were dating anyone, which he clearly asked just to be polite. Then he left early because he had an early morning. He did have an early morning, Sarah. Elena's voice was gentle but firm. He stayed for an hour and a half at a dinner party you spent $70 in 3 days preparing. An hour and a half. Jake didn't even show up. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Jake had a work thing that he mentioned to you the day of your party, after you'd already bought all the food and rearranged your furniture and cleaned your apartment until it looked like a museum. Elena sat back down, her anger giving way to something sadder. And you were so grateful for the hour and a half that Tom did give you that you didn't even notice you'd been treated like an afterthought. The words landed like physical blows. Sarah wanted to argue, to defend her family, to explain that Elena didn't understand the subtle dynamics of William's family love. But the conversation she'd overheard made it impossible to maintain those comfortable lies. They love me, Sarah said weakly. They're not good at showing it. Baby, Elena said, and her voice was so gentle it almost hurt to hear. Love isn't something you have to decode. Love isn't something you have to earn through perfect party planning and color-coded spreadsheets. Love doesn't make you feel like you're constantly auditioning for a role you're not sure you'll get to keep. Sarah thought about Marcus, about the way he'd held her after bad days at work, the way he'd brought her coffee in bed on Sunday mornings, The way he'd never once made her feel like she needed to prove she deserved his attention. She thought about how she'd dismissed his concerns about her family as jealousy, how she'd chosen their conditional approval over his unconditional acceptance. "Marcus tried to tell me," she whispered. "Marcus tried to tell you a lot of things. You were so terrified of disappointing your family that you couldn't hear him." Elena reached for Sarah's hand. "You know what he said to me after you guys broke up?" Sarah's head snapped up. "You talked to Marcus?" "He called me. He was worried about you. He said—" Elena paused, as if deciding whether to reveal something that might hurt. "He said dating. You was like watching someone slowly disappear. That every family gathering, every phone call with them, every time you tried to make them happy, you came back a little smaller, a little less yourself." The truth of it hit Sarah like a physical force. She thought about all the parts of herself she'd learned to minimize around her family. Her love of art films they found pretentious. Her interest in travel they considered impractical. Her career achievements they dismissed as unimportant. She'd spent so many years editing herself to fit their expectations that she'd almost forgotten what her unedited self looked like. "I don't know who I am without them," Sarah admitted. "I don't know who I am if I'm not trying to make them love me." "You're someone worth loving without trying," Elena said fiercely. "You're funny and smart and incredibly thoughtful. You remember everyone's birthdays and their favorite books, and the stories they tell about their childhood pets. You cry at commercials with dogs in them, and you know way too much about celebrity divorces, and you make the world's best chocolate chip cookies, not because you're trying to impress anyone, but because you genuinely love feeding people." Sarah felt tears starting again, but these were different, softer, less desperate. "You're also someone who's been so busy performing gratitude for a family that took you in, that you forgot they're the lucky ones. They got you, Sarah. They got this amazing, caring, brilliant person, and instead of celebrating that, they made you feel like you had to earn your place at their table every single day." "What if I stop trying?" Sarah asked. "What if I stop organizing everything and coordinating everything and managing everyone's feelings? What if they decide they don't want me around anymore?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and sure. "Then you'll know they never really wanted you in the first place, and you'll finally be free to find people who do." The words should have been terrifying, but instead, Sarah felt something like relief. For the first time in 25 years, someone had given her permission to stop performing, to stop earning, to stop proving her worth through exhaustive service to people who found her efforts mildly burdensome. "My mom calls me every week," Elena said suddenly. "Every single week, just to hear my voice. She doesn't want anything from me. She doesn't need me to organize family dinners, or remember everyone's dietary restrictions, or coordinate holiday schedules. She calls because she misses me. Because hearing from me makes her day better, not because I make her life easier." Sarah thought about her own phone calls with Maggie. Always purpose-driven, always about logistics or coordination or family. Updates. When was the last time Maggie had called just to hear her voice? "That's what family love looks like," Elena continued. "It looks like wanting someone in your life because they make your world brighter, not because they make your world run more smoothly." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the Thai food growing cold on the coffee table. Outside, the city moved through its evening rhythms, and Sarah felt like she was seeing it clearly for the first time in years. She wasn't looking at it through the lens of family obligations or reunion preparations or carefully managed relationships. She was just seeing it as herself, whoever that was. "The reunion is this weekend," Sarah said finally. "Are you going to go?" Sarah considered the question. Part of her wanted to skip it entirely, to avoid the confrontation and the potential devastation of learning once and for all whether her family could love her without her careful performance of usefulness. But a larger part of her, a part that was growing stronger by the hour, knew she needed to find out. "I think I have to. I think I need to see what happens if I show up as just me." Elena smiled, and it was the first smile Sarah had seen in days that didn't require anything from her in return. "I think that's the smartest thing you've said in years. Will you come with me? Try and stop me. Someone needs to be there, to watch you finally stop apologizing for taking up space." As Sarah drove home later that night, she felt something shifting inside her chest. Not healing, not yet, but shifting. like tectonic plates finding new positions after an earthquake. She was still afraid, still uncertain about who she would be without her carefully constructed role as family coordinator and emotional manager. But for the first time in her adult life, she was also curious. Curious about what it would feel like to walk into a family gathering without a spreadsheet or a timeline or a desperate need for approval. Curious about whether the people who claimed to love her could recognize her without the costume of perfect preparation she'd been wearing for 25 years. She had 3 days to find out. Friday evening found Sarah sitting in her car outside, her childhood home, gathering courage she wasn't sure she possessed. The 2-story colonial looked exactly the same as always. Well-maintained lawn, cheerful flower boxes, the porch swing where she'd spent countless summer evenings reading while Maggie and David worked in the garden. It should have felt like sanctuary. Instead, it felt like a test she wasn't prepared to take. Elena's words from the night before echoed in her mind. "You'll know they never really wanted you in the first place." Sarah wasn't sure she was ready for that knowledge, but she couldn't unknow what she'd heard in Jake's phone call. The only way forward was through the uncomfortable territory of truth. She knocked instead of using her key, a small rebellion that felt both necessary and strange. When David answered the door, his face lit up with the kind of genuine pleasure that made Sarah's chest tighten with confused hope. "Sarah, what a nice surprise. Come in, sweetheart. Your mom's in the kitchen fighting with that new coffee machine." The familiar rhythms of her childhood home enveloped her. The soft murmur of the evening news from the living room, the smell of Maggie's homemade bread, the way late afternoon light filtered through the dining room windows she'd looked through during countless family dinners, but now she found herself cataloging details she'd never noticed before. How small the house felt compared to Uncle Tom's sprawling suburban mansion. How careful Maggie and David were with their words, their emotions, their conflicts. "Sarah!" Maggie emerged from the kitchen with flour-dusted hands and that particular smile she reserved for unexpected visits. "I was just thinking about you. How are the reunion preparations going?" The question was innocent, automatic, but it landed like a small blade between Sarah's ribs. Of course, the first thing her mother asked about was the reunion. Of course, their relationship was immediately filtered through Sarah's usefulness to the larger family structure. "Actually," Sarah said, settling into the kitchen chair she'd occupied through thousands of childhood meals, "I wanted to talk to you and Dad about that." Something in her tone must have alerted Maggie, because her smile faltered slightly. "Is everything okay? Do you need help with something?" David joined them at the kitchen table, and Sarah found herself studying their faces with new eyes. These people had raised her, loved her, given her stability and opportunity, and a foundation she could build a life on. But they'd also never quite known what to do with her grief over losing her birth parents, her questions about her Chinese heritage, her persistent feeling of being slightly out of step with the Williams family rhythms. "I've been thinking about family dynamics lately," Sarah began carefully. "About how we all interact, how we show love, that sort of thing." Maggie and David exchanged a quick glance, the kind of wordless communication that developed between couples who'd been married for 30 years. Sarah caught it and felt something cold settle in her stomach. "What kind of dynamics?" David asked in his careful, measured way. "Well, like the reunion, I've been doing most of the planning for the past few years, and I'm wondering if that's because you all think I'm good at it, or because no one else wants to do it." Another glance between her parents. Longer this time. "Sweetheart, you are good at it," Maggie said with forced brightness. "You're incredibly organized, and you think of details the rest of us miss. The reunions are always wonderful because of your hard work. But what if I didn't do all that work? What if I just showed up, like everyone else, and expected to enjoy the gathering without managing it?" The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Sarah watched her parents' faces, seeing them struggle with a question they'd apparently never considered. "I suppose," David said slowly, "someone else would step up, or we'd figure it out as we went along. But it might not be as well organized," Maggie added quickly, as if trying to reassure Sarah of her importance. "Would that be okay? If it wasn't as well organized?" "Of course it would be okay," Maggie said, but there was something in her voice, a note of uncertainty that suggested she wasn't entirely sure. Sarah took a breath and decided to push deeper. What about the family in general? Do you think they accept me? Really accept me? The question hung in the air like smoke. David cleared his throat. Maggie fiddled with her wedding ring. What do you mean, accept you? Maggie asked carefully. I mean, do they see me as really part of the family? Or do they see me as someone who was brought into the family and is still, I don't know, proving herself? David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sarah, you are part of this family. You've always been part of this family. I know that's what we've always said. But I'm asking what you think they feel. Uncle Tom, Aunt Linda, Jake. Do you think they see me the same way they see each other? The silence this time was deafening. Sarah watched her parents' faces and saw them grappling with truths they'd apparently been avoiding for years. Some people, Maggie said finally, her voice very quiet, have a harder time with change than others. What kind of change? When you joined our family, it was an adjustment for everyone, and some people might have needed more time to fully embrace that adjustment. Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. 25 years, Mom. How much time do they need? David reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Sweetheart, if someone in this family has made you feel unwelcome or unaccepted, then that's their failing, not yours. But you've known about it. You've seen it. Another exchanged glance. We've seen tension sometimes, Maggie admitted. Comments that weren't as kind as they could have been. Attitudes that weren't as open as we would have liked. And you never said anything? We thought, David said carefully, that addressing it directly might make things worse. That it might create more division instead of healing it. Sarah stared at her father. This man who'd taught her to ride a bike and helped her with math homework, and walked her down the aisle at her college graduation, and felt a profound sense of disappointment settle in her bones. So you chose family peace over protecting me. That's not... Maggie started, then stopped. We chose what we thought was best for everyone, including the people who were being cruel to your daughter. Sarah, David's voice carried a note of warning. That's not fair. Isn't it? Sarah pulled her hand away from his. I've spent 25 years trying to earn acceptance from people who were never going to give it freely, and you knew that. You watched me exhaust myself trying to prove I belonged. And you said nothing because it was easier than confronting the people who were making me feel like I had to prove it. Maggie's eyes filled with tears. We love you, Sarah. We've always loved you completely. I know you have. But love isn't just a feeling, is it? Love is also action. Love is protection. Love is standing up for the people you care about when they can't stand up for themselves. We did stand up for you, David said, but his voice lacked conviction. When? When did you ever tell Uncle Tom to stop making comments about my career not being real work? When did you ever tell Aunt Linda to stop criticizing my appearance or my life choices? When did you ever tell Jake to include me in conversations, instead of talking around me like I wasn't there? The questions hit their target. Sarah could see it in the way her parents' faces crumpled, in the way they looked at each other with the recognition of people who'd been caught in a truth they'd been avoiding. We thought you were handling it well, Maggie whispered. You always seemed so strong, so capable of managing difficult situations. I was a child when this started, Mom. I was 8 years old, wondering why Jake's friends from school were always welcome at family gatherings, but mine weren't. I was 12, trying to figure out why Uncle Tom asked Jake about his future plans, but never asked me about mine. I was 16, desperate to understand why I had to work twice as hard for half the approval. We should have done more, David said quietly. We should have protected you better. The admission should have felt like victory, but instead it felt like mourning. Sarah was grieving, not just for the acceptance she'd never received from her extended family, but for the protection she'd never received from the people who'd claimed to love her most. Why didn't you? She asked. Why was keeping peace with them more important than keeping faith with me? Maggie and David looked at each other for a long moment, having one of their wordless conversations. When Maggie finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Because we were afraid. Afraid?
Of what?
Afraid that if we pushed too hard, if we demanded too much, they might pull away entirely. And we thought it was better for you to have some relationship with your extended family, even if it wasn't perfect, than to have no relationship at all. Sarah felt something shift inside her, not anger, exactly, but a kind of profound sadness for all of them. For her parents, who'd been so afraid of loss that they'd enabled cruelty. For herself, who'd spent 25 years performing worthiness for people who'd never intended to see her as worthy. For the family that could have been, if anyone had been brave enough to demand better. But what if, Sarah said slowly, what if having no relationship would have been better than having a relationship built on me constantly proving I deserve to exist in their space? David's shoulders sagged. We didn't think of it that way. I know you didn't, and I know you love me. But love without courage, love without action, love that prioritizes everyone's comfort over one person's dignity. That's not enough, anymore. Sarah stood up from the table, and her parents looked up at her with expressions of loss and regret that made her heart ache. I'm going to the reunion tomorrow, she said. But I'm going as myself. Just myself. No spreadsheets, no coordination, no desperate attempts to make everything perfect for people who've never appreciated the effort. And I need to know that you'll support me in that, even if it makes other people uncomfortable. Of course we'll support you, Maggie said quickly. Even if Uncle Tom gets angry? Even if Aunt Linda makes snide comments? Even if Jake decides to make it an issue? Her parents looked at each other again, and Sarah saw the fear that had been driving their decisions for 25 years. Yes, David said finally, and there was something new in his voice. Something that sounded like resolve. Even then. Sarah kissed them both goodbye and walked to her car with the strange sensation of having lost something and gained something simultaneously. She'd lost the illusion that her parents were the unconditional protectors she'd needed them to be. But she'd gained something too. The knowledge that she could protect herself, that she could demand better, that she didn't need anyone's permission to exist authentically in spaces that were supposed to welcome her. Tomorrow, she would find out what her family looked like when she stopped performing for their approval. Tonight, she would go home and prepare for the most important reunion of her life, not with her extended family, but with herself. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of Chicago weather that made everything feel muted and uncertain. Sarah stood at her kitchen window, watching droplets race down the glass while her phone buzzed with the third call from Marcus Thompson in 2 days. She'd been avoiding his calls since Wednesday, when he'd somehow heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd been seen crying at Elena's apartment. The problem with dating someone for 2 years was that they learned to read your patterns, your hiding places, your particular brand of crisis management. On the 4th ring, she finally answered. I'm fine, Marcus. No, you're not. His voice was gentle but certain, the way it had been when he'd known she was spiraling but had been too proud to admit it. Elena called me. Sarah felt a flash of betrayal, quickly followed by gratitude. Of course Elena had called him. Elena believed in reinforcements, in surrounding people with love when they were too stubborn to ask for it themselves. What did she tell you? Enough. Can we meet? There's something I've been wanting to say to you for months, and now seems like the right time. Sarah found herself agreeing before she could think of reasons to refuse. Maybe it was the strange liberation of having nothing left to lose. Or maybe she was finally ready to hear truths she'd been too afraid to face when they were together. They met at Café Moustache, the small coffee shop in Andersonville, where they'd had their first official date 3 years ago. Marcus was already there when she arrived, looking unfairly handsome in the kind of effortless way that had initially intimidated her. Dark skin, warm eyes, the confident posture of someone who'd never had to question whether he belonged in the spaces he occupied. Everything about him was the opposite of her careful anxiety. You look terrible, he said with characteristic directness as she slid into the booth across from him. Thanks. Really what I needed to hear today. I mean, you look like someone who's finally stopped pretending everything is fine. Marcus signaled the waitress for coffee. It's actually an improvement. Sarah felt tears threaten and forced them back. She'd cried enough this week. Elena told you about the phone call, She told me you overheard your cousin saying some brutal shit about you. She didn't give me details, but honestly, I don't need them. I could probably guess. Could you? Marcus leaned back in the booth, studying her face with the kind of attention that had always made her feel simultaneously seen and exposed. Let me guess. Something about you trying too hard. Something about you not really fitting in. Something about you being grateful they tolerate you instead of angry they don't celebrate you. The accuracy of his assessment left Sarah breathless. How did you? Because I watched it happen, Sarah. For 2 years. I watched you disappear. A little more after every family gathering. I watched you come home from reunions and holiday dinners, looking like you'd spent the day auditioning for a role you weren't sure you'd get to keep. Sarah stared at her coffee cup, unable to meet his eyes. You tried to tell me. I tried to tell you a lot of things. You weren't ready to hear them. And now? Now you look like someone who might be ready to hear the truth instead of spending all your energy protecting yourself from it. The waitress brought their coffee, and Sarah used the interruption to gather courage she wasn't sure she possessed. When they were alone again, Marcus leaned forward. Do you remember the barbecue at your uncle's house last summer? The one where you spent 3 days marinating that Korean beef because you thought it would be interesting to share some of your heritage with the family? Sarah remembered. She'd researched recipes, gone to 3 different stores to find the right ingredients, practiced the marinade twice to get it perfect. She'd been so excited to share something meaningful, something that connected her to the part of her identity the Williams family had never quite known how to acknowledge. You were so proud of that dish, Marcus continued. So excited to share it. And when we got there, your uncle took one bite and made that face. You know the one, like he'd tasted something mildly unpleasant, and said, well, that's certainly different, and then spent the rest of the afternoon talking about how much he loved traditional American barbecue. Sarah's chest tightened with remembered humiliation. He was just being honest about his preferences. Sarah. Marcus's voice was firm. Stop. Just stop defending them for 2 minutes and let yourself remember how you felt in that moment. She closed her eyes and let herself go back to that afternoon. The careful hope she'd carried, the hours of preparation, the way her heart had sunk when Uncle Tom's comment made it clear that her effort to share her culture was seen as an imposition rather than a gift. The way the other family members had politely avoided the dish for the rest of the afternoon. The way she'd spent the drive home apologizing to Marcus for subjecting him to her family's awkwardness. I felt like I'd made a mistake, she whispered. Like I'd been presumptuous, trying to force something foreign into their space. And that's exactly what they wanted you to feel. Not consciously, maybe. But that's what happened. You brought something beautiful, something that honored your heritage, and they made you feel like you should be grateful they tolerated it instead of celebrating the fact that you wanted to share it with them. Marcus reached across the table and touched her hand, the gesture gentle but electric in the way his touch had always been. You came home that night and spent an hour researching traditional American barbecue recipes. You were already planning how to do better next time, how to be more acceptable, how to choose family harmony over your own identity. The truth of it hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had done exactly that. She'd internalized their rejection as her failure, their discomfort as her responsibility to fix. I should have been furious, she said slowly. I should have been hurt that they couldn't appreciate the effort, the meaning behind it. You should have been a lot of things. But instead, you made yourself smaller. You made your heritage smaller. You made your identity smaller. Marcus's voice was gentle but uncompromising. And I watched you do it. And I tried to tell you what I was seeing. And you couldn't hear me. Because hearing me would have meant acknowledging that the family you'd spent your whole life trying to please wasn't worthy of the effort. Sarah felt something break open in her chest. Not breaking apart, but breaking open. Like a dam releasing pressure that had been building for years. You tried to warn me. I tried to love you enough to help you see your own worth. But you were so busy earning their approval that you couldn't accept mine freely given. Why didn't you fight harder for me? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of her hand. Because I realized that fighting for you meant fighting against the version of yourself you'd been performing for so long that you thought it was real, and I couldn't compete with 25 years of conditioning. So you left. I left because watching someone you love slowly disappear into other people's expectations is unbearable, and because I realized that staying would make me complicit in it. Sarah felt tears starting again, but these were different, cleaner somehow, less desperate. I chose them over you. You chose the idea of belonging somewhere over the reality of being loved somewhere. There's a difference. I was so scared, Sarah admitted. So scared that if I stopped trying so hard to fit in with them, I'd have nowhere to belong at all. And now? Sarah thought about Elena's fierce loyalty, about Marcus sitting across from her with gentle honesty, about her parents' frightened love that had been real but insufficient. Now I'm starting to think that belonging somewhere that requires you to constantly audition for your place isn't really belonging at all. Marcus smiled, and it was the first smile she'd seen from him in months that didn't carry any traces of sadness or regret. There she is. Who? The Sarah I fell in love with. The one who existed before she learned to edit herself for other people's comfort. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing exactly, but recognition. Like coming home, to a house she'd forgotten she owned. I fucked up, she said. With you, with us. I prioritized their conditional acceptance over your unconditional love, and I lost something real in the process. You did fuck up, Marcus agreed. But you were also 25 years old and doing the best you could with the tools you'd been given. The tools your family gave you were broken, Sarah. You just didn't know there were better ones available. Is there? Sarah hesitated, afraid to ask. Is there any chance we could try again, someday? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him weighing words carefully. Ask me again in 6 months. After you've had time to figure out who you are when you're not performing for their approval. After you've learned to value yourself the way the people who love you have always valued you. And if I do that work? If you do that work, then we'll see. But Sarah. His voice carried a note of gentle warning. Don't do that work to win me back. Do it because you deserve to know who you really are underneath all the trying. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence, and when Marcus walked her to her car, he kissed her forehead in a gesture that felt like both goodbye and possibility. For what it's worth, he said, I'm proud of you for finally stopping the performance. It takes courage to show up as yourself when you've been playing a character for so long. Sarah drove home with Marcus's words echoing in her mind. She thought about the reunion tomorrow, about walking into that pavilion without her armor of perfect preparation, without her desperate need to manage everyone's experience. The thought still terrified her, but underneath the terror was something else, a strange, unfamiliar sense of anticipation. For the first time in her adult life, she was about to discover what it felt like to simply exist in her family's space without earning her place there. She was about to find out whether the love they claimed to feel for her was strong enough to survive her authenticity. And maybe, just maybe, she was about to find out who Sarah Chen-Williams really was when she wasn't trying to be who everyone else needed her to be. Sunday morning arrived with relentless sunshine, the kind of perfect weather that would have sent Sarah into overdrive in previous years. Checking forecasts, adjusting timelines, making sure every detail aligned with the meteorological blessing they'd received. Instead, she lay in bed until almost 10 o'clock, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of Chicago waking up outside her window. Her phone had been buzzing intermittently since 8 a.m. Texts from Aunt Linda asking about setup timing. A call from Jake that she'd declined. Another text from Maggie wondering if she needed help carrying anything to the pavilion. The familiar choreography of family logistics that had once made Sarah feel essential now felt like invitations to a dance she no longer wanted to perform. She made coffee in her pajamas and sat at her kitchen table, looking at the reunion planning. Materials that had been gathering dust since Wednesday. The color-coded spreadsheets, the laminated timeline, the backup supplies she'd never purchased, the recipe cards that remained unprinted. Evidence of a life organized around other people's needs and expectations. Elena had texted earlier. Ready to go be your authentic self today? I'm proud of you already. Marcus had sent a simple message. Thinking of you. Remember, you belong anywhere you choose to exist authentically. But her family's messages all carried the same underlying assumption, that Sarah would show up, as she always had, prepared and organized and ready to manage their experience. None of them seemed to consider that she might arrive as simply herself. Sarah opened her laptop and stared at the reunion spreadsheet one last time. 3 tabs of meticulous planning, hours of coordination, a blueprint for another perfectly executed family gathering where she would spend the entire day managing details instead of enjoying moments. She closed the laptop without opening any of the files. Instead, she took a long shower, chose clothes that made her feel comfortable rather than appropriate, and spent an hour researching something she'd never allowed herself to explore: her Chinese heritage. She looked up information about her birth, father's family name, read about cultural traditions she'd never been encouraged to claim, studied photos of places she'd never been invited to consider home. The irony wasn't lost on her. While she'd spent 25 years trying to earn acceptance from one family, she'd never explored her connection to another. At noon, her phone rang. Jake's name appeared on the screen, and Sarah felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. But underneath the anxiety was something new, a kind of calm resolution that came from knowing exactly what she'd heard him say about her. She answered. Hey, Jake. Sarah, thank God. I've been trying to reach you all morning. Mom is freaking out because she hasn't heard from you about setup. Did something happen with the pavilion reservation? Sarah felt a familiar tug of responsibility, the ingrained impulse to reassure and problem-solve and manage everyone's emotional temperature. But today, she let the silence stretch. Sarah? Are you there? I'm here. Okay, so what's the timeline looking like? Do you need help loading your car? I can swing by if you're running behind. I'm not running behind, Jake. I'm just not doing setup this year. The silence on the other end was profound. Sarah could practically hear Jake recalibrating, trying to process information that didn't fit the established pattern. What do you mean you're not doing setup? I mean, I'm planning to arrive when the reunion starts and enjoy it like a guest instead of managing it like an event coordinator. But who's going to handle the logistics? The food tables, the games. For the kids, I assumed the family would figure it out together, the way families usually do. Another silence. Sarah could hear Jake breathing, could almost feel him struggling to understand what was happening. Sarah, is everything okay? You're acting really strange. I'm acting different. That's not the same as strange. Okay, but the reunion is in 3 hours. People are expecting me to handle everything so they don't have to think about it. But I've decided I'd rather participate than coordinate. This is really last minute to be making changes like this. Jake's voice carried a note of irritation that Sarah recognized, the tone he used when things weren't going according to his expectations. People are counting on you. People are counting on me to make their lives easier. That's different from needing me. Sarah, what the hell is going on? You're being really selfish right now. The word hit exactly as intended, a precision strike designed to make her feel guilty, to shame her back into her familiar role as family facilitator. But instead of the usual rush of apologetic anxiety, Sarah felt something else. Clarity. You know what, Jake? You're right. I am being selfish. For the first time in my adult life, I'm prioritizing my own experience over everyone else's convenience, and it feels amazing. This isn't like you. Maybe the person you think I am isn't actually who I am. Maybe it's just who I've been performing being. Jake's frustration was audible now. Look, I don't know what's gotten into you, but we can talk about your personal growth journey later. Right now, we need to focus on not ruining the reunion for everyone else. Sarah closed her eyes and made a decision that felt like jumping off a cliff. Jake, I overheard our phone conversation on Wednesday. The silence this time was different. Electric. Dangerous. Sarah could feel Jake's shock through the phone. What conversation? The one where you forgot to hang up after we talked about reunion planning. The one where you, Uncle Tom, and Aunt Linda spent 8 minutes discussing how pathetic and desperate I am. Sarah, The one where you called me the try-hard and questioned whether I'm really family. The one where Uncle Tom said I was trying to buy my way into belonging. The one where you all agreed that I don't really understand any of you. Sarah's voice was steady, calm, almost conversational. She felt strangely detached from the words, as if she were reporting on someone else's life. You weren't supposed to hear that. No, I wasn't. And for 25 years I didn't hear all the other conversations like it. I was too busy performing gratitude and usefulness to notice that the people I was performing for found my efforts annoying rather than endearing. Sarah, you're taking it out of context. What context makes it okay to mock someone's desperate attempts to belong? What context makes it acceptable to question whether an adopted family member is really family after 25 years? Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was smaller, less certain. We were frustrated. You can be a lot sometimes, with all the organizing and the coordinating. It feels like you don't trust us to handle things ourselves. So, instead of telling me directly that my help was unwelcome, you decided to mock me behind my back and then let me continue exhausting myself, trying to earn approval you were never planning to give. It's not that simple. It actually is that simple, Jake. You could have said, Sarah, we appreciate your help, but we'd prefer to keep things more casual. You could have included me in family conversations instead of talking around me. You could have treated me like someone whose feelings mattered instead of someone whose feelings were inconvenient. Sarah heard Jake sigh, and for a moment, she almost felt sorry for him. Almost fell back into her familiar role as emotional caretaker, ready to make his discomfort easier to bear. Almost. Look, Jake said, maybe we haven't always handled things perfectly, but you have to admit, you can be pretty intense about family stuff. It's like you're always trying to prove something. I was trying to prove something. I was trying to prove I deserved to belong. And the fact that I felt like I had to prove, that should have been a signal to all of you that something was wrong with how you were treating me. Not evidence that something was wrong with me. So, what happens now? Are you going to skip the reunion? Make everyone feel guilty for not appreciating you enough? Sarah almost laughed at how quickly Jake had moved from denial to defensiveness to manipulation. How quickly he'd made her pain about his comfort. I'm going to the reunion, Jake, but I'm going as myself. Not as your event coordinator or emotional manager or grateful adopted cousin who works twice as hard for half the acknowledgement, just as myself. And what does that mean, exactly? It means you'll have to figure out your own logistics. It means you'll have to manage your own emotions. It means you'll have to decide whether you want a relationship with me based on who I actually am, or whether you've only ever been interested in what I could do for you. Sarah. I'll see you at the reunion, Jake. Sarah hung up before he could respond, and for the first time in days, she felt like she could breathe properly. Her phone immediately started buzzing with return calls, but she turned it off and set it aside. She had 2 hours before the reunion started. 2 hours to prepare for the most important conversation of her life, not with her family, but with herself. She spent those 2 hours not planning or coordinating or anticipating anyone else's needs. Instead, she sat in her living room and thought about who she was underneath all the trying. She thought about the parts of herself she'd learned to hide, her love of art films and foreign music, her curiosity about her Chinese heritage, her dreams of travel and adventure that the Williams family had always dismissed as impractical. She thought about Marcus's words. Don't do that work to win me back. Do it because you deserve to know who you really are underneath all the trying. She thought about Elena's fierce loyalty, her parents' frightened love, her family's conditional acceptance, and slowly, quietly, she began to remember what it felt like to value herself not for what she could provide to others, but for who she was when no one was watching. At 2 o'clock, Sarah Chen-Williams got in her car and drove to face her family. As herself, without armor, without performance, without the desperate need to earn love that should have been freely given. She had no idea what would happen next. For the first time in her adult life, that uncertainty felt like freedom rather than terror. Sarah arrived at Millennium Park at exactly 3 o'clock. Not 30 minutes early with tables to arrange and supplies to distribute, but precisely when the reunion was scheduled to begin. She parked her car and sat for a moment, watching through the windshield as her family moved through the familiar choreography of gathering. Uncle Tom commanded the grilling area with his usual authority, directing Jake and David in the arrangement of folding tables. Aunt Linda held court near the pavilion, her voice carrying across the park as she discussed the unseasonably perfect weather with a cluster of female relatives. Children ran between the adults, their laughter mixing with the distant sounds of the city. It looked exactly like every Williams family reunion for the past 25 years. The same dynamics, the same hierarchies, the same careful dance of personalities that Sarah had spent decades trying to navigate successfully. But today, she was seeing it all through different eyes. Not as a participant desperate to earn her place, but as an observer finally able to recognize the performance for what it was. Elena appeared at her passenger door, sliding into the car with the kind of protective energy that made Sarah grateful for chosen family. "Ready for this?" "I have no idea," Sarah admitted. "But I think that might be the point. Remember, you're not responsible for managing anyone's emotions today. Not your parents' anxiety, not Jake's guilt, not Uncle Tom's discomfort. You're just responsible for showing up as yourself." Sarah nodded, though the concept still felt foreign. 25 years of emotional management didn't disappear overnight. They walked toward the pavilion together, and Sarah felt the familiar weight of family attention settling on her shoulders. But instead of the usual warm anticipation she'd once interpreted as love, she now recognized it for what it had always been: assessment. Her family was evaluating her performance before she'd even reached the picnic tables. "Sarah," Aunt Linda's voice carried its characteristic blend of sweetness and calculation. "There you are. We were starting to worry. Jake said you were having some kind of planning crisis?" The question was delivered with the particular smile Linda reserved for moments when she suspected drama but wanted to appear concerned rather than curious. Sarah recognized the expression. She'd been reading these subtle social cues her entire life, calibrating her responses to minimize discomfort and maximize approval. Today, she chose honesty instead. "No crisis, Aunt Linda. I just decided not to coordinate everything this year." Linda's smile faltered slightly, confusion replacing practiced warmth. "Oh, well, I'm sure someone can help figure out the logistics." "I'm sure you're right." Sarah kept walking, leaving Linda to process the unprecedented experience of receiving a response that didn't include an apology, an explanation, or an offer to fix whatever problem might arise. Near the grilling station, Uncle Tom was holding forth about construction schedules and municipal contracts, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. Jake stood beside him, nodding at appropriate intervals, playing his role as the dutiful son and heir apparent to the family business. When Tom noticed Sarah approaching, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The easy confidence remained, but underneath it, Sarah could see something new: wariness, as if he were trying to determine what kind of conversation they were about to have. "Sarah, sweetheart, good to see you." Tom's hug was brief, perfunctory. "Jake mentioned you might be running a little behind today." "I'm right on time, actually." Of course, though I notice the food tables aren't quite organized the way they usually are. Should we expect some chaos this year?" Tom's laugh was meant to sound jovial, but Sarah heard the edge underneath, the subtle criticism disguised as gentle teasing. In previous years, she would have rushed to explain, to apologize, to offer solutions. Today, she simply said, "I imagine people will figure it out." Tom's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed this unfamiliar version of his niece. "Well, that's certainly a change of pace for you." Sarah felt Elena's presence beside her like a shield, and it gave her courage to hold Tom's gaze steadily. "People change, Uncle Tom. Sometimes they stop doing things that don't serve them. And coordinating family gatherings doesn't serve you anymore." The question was posed with false curiosity, but Sarah could hear the real question underneath. "Who do you think you are, refusing to fulfill your assigned role?" "Not the way I was doing it, no." Tom's smile took on a sharper edge. I see. And what way were you doing it? Sarah recognized the trap, the invitation to justify herself, to defend her previous efforts, to apologize for being ungrateful for the opportunity to serve. In the past, she would have stumbled into that trap eagerly, desperate to explain herself in ways that would restore family harmony. Instead, she said simply, I was doing it like someone who thought she had to earn her place here. The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of uncomfortable silence that spread outward from their small circle. Jake stepped closer to his father, his body language shifting into protective mode. Other family members, sensing tension, began to drift toward their conversation with the magnetic pull of people drawn to conflict. That's an interesting perspective, Tom said carefully. Though I'm not sure where you got the idea that you needed to earn anything. You've always been family, Sarah. Have I? The question hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Sarah watched Tom's face as he processed it, saw him recognize that this wasn't going to be a conversation. He could redirect or dismiss. Of course you have. That's a ridiculous question. Is it? Because family members don't usually have to prove their worth through perfect event coordination. Family members don't usually get criticized for sharing parts of their heritage. Family members don't usually get called tryhards behind their backs. Tom's face went very still. Around them, the casual conversations of the reunion continued. But Sarah could feel the attention of nearby relatives focusing on their exchange like a lens collecting sunlight. I don't know what you think you heard. I know exactly what I heard, Uncle Tom. Wednesday morning. Jake forgot to hang up after our reunion planning call. The blood drained from Tom's face so quickly that Sarah almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Jake stepped forward, his voice carrying forced casualness. Sarah, maybe this isn't the time or place for what, Jake? For honesty? For addressing the things you all say about me when you think I can't hear? Maggie appeared at Sarah's elbow, her maternal instincts activated by the rising tension. Sweetheart, what's going on? Everyone seems upset. Everyone seems upset because I'm finally talking about things we've all been pretending don't exist. David joined the growing circle, his expression concerned and confused. Sarah looked around at her family, all the people she'd spent 25 years trying to please, and felt something crystallize inside her chest. I overheard a conversation this week, she said, raising her voice just enough to include the relatives who were straining to hear. A conversation where Jake, Uncle Tom, and Aunt Linda discussed how pathetic my efforts to fit in are, how I try too hard, how I don't really understand any of you, how some of you still question whether I'm really family after 25 years. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, their voices fading to whispers. Linda stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Sarah, you're being very dramatic. If you misunderstood something, I didn't misunderstand anything. I heard 8 minutes of you all discussing my desperate attempts at belonging like they were personality flaws, rather than responses to being treated like a perpetual outsider. That's not fair, Jake said, his voice rising. We've never treated you like an outsider. Sarah turned to face her cousin directly, and for the first time in her life, she didn't modulate her tone to manage his emotions. Really, Jake? Then, why do you call me the try-hard behind my back? Why do you discuss my life choices like they're evidence of my inability to understand real family values? Why do you talk about having to deal with Sarah at family gatherings like I'm a problem to be managed rather than a person to be welcomed? Jake's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Around them, Sarah could see other family members processing this information, some with shock, some with recognition, some with the uncomfortable awareness of people who'd been complicit in dynamics they'd never examined. You're taking everything out of context, Linda said, her voice shrill with defensiveness. We were just expressing frustration. About what? About my desperate desire to belong? About my efforts to contribute? About my attempts to share my heritage with people who were supposed to be my family? Sarah felt 25 years of suppressed anger rising in her chest, clean and bright and liberating. Do you know what I did after Uncle Tom made that face at my Korean barbecue last summer? I went home and researched traditional American barbecue recipes. I spent hours trying to figure out how to be more acceptable to you. I made myself smaller, made my culture smaller, made my identity smaller, because I thought that was what love looked like. Tom's voice was gruff, defensive. Nobody asked you to do that. You didn't have to ask. You made it clear through your reactions, your comments, your casual dismissals of anything that didn't fit your narrow definition of family appropriate. You taught me that my worth in this family was conditional on my ability to minimize the parts of myself that made you uncomfortable. Maggie stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. Sarah, honey, you never meant to hurt me. I know that, Mom. But impact matters more than intention. And the impact of 25 years of subtle rejection, of having to constantly prove my place, of being tolerated rather than celebrated, is that I learned to hate the parts of myself that made me different. David cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. We could have done better. We should have protected you better. Yes, you should have. All of you should have. When Jake excluded me from conversations, when Uncle Tom dismissed my career, when Aunt Linda criticized my appearance, when any of you made me feel like gratitude was the price of admission to this family, any of you could have spoken up. Any of you could have said that wasn't acceptable. Sarah looked around the circle of faces, some angry, some ashamed, some confused, and felt the strange liberation of finally telling the truth. But you didn't. Because my discomfort was less important than your comfort. My pain was less significant than family harmony. My dignity was an acceptable sacrifice for everyone else's peace. Elena stepped closer to Sarah, her presence a reminder that not all family relationships required performance or apology. So what happens now? Tom asked, his voice containing the first notes of genuine uncertainty Sarah had ever heard from him. Now you have to decide what kind of family you want to be. Do you want to keep pretending that 25 years of subtle cruelty was just family teasing? Do you want to keep expecting me to be grateful for tolerance instead of demanding actual acceptance? Or do you want to do the work of learning how to love someone without requiring them to minimize themselves for your comfort? Jake stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. You're being really unfair right now, Sarah. We're not perfect, but we've always what, Jake? Always loved me? Love isn't just a feeling. Love is action. Love is protection. Love is celebrating someone for who they are, not tolerating them despite who they are. You can't just show up and blow up 25 years of family relationships because you overheard one conversation taken out of context. Sarah felt something snap inside her chest, not breaking, but releasing. Like a cord that had been pulled too tight for too long finally letting go. Watch me. The words came out quiet, but absolute. Around her, the Williams family reunion continued its careful choreography, but Sarah was no longer performing her part. She was simply standing in the middle of it all, finally taking up space without apology, finally existing without earning it, finally demanding the kind of love she'd spent her entire life believing she didn't deserve. And for the first time, in 25 years, she didn't care whether they could give it to her or not. The silence that followed Sarah's declaration stretched taut as a wire, vibrating with 25 years of accumulated tension. Around the pavilion, other family members had stopped pretending not to listen. Cousins, aunts, uncles, and family friends formed a loose circle around the confrontation, their faces reflecting varying degrees of shock, discomfort, and recognition. Sarah could see her 8-year-old cousin Emma clutching her mother's hand, wide-eyed at the unprecedented sight of adults saying things they actually meant instead of the careful diplomatic language that usually characterized family gatherings. She could see her teenage nephew David, named after her adoptive father, with his phone discreetly recording, understanding instinctively that he was witnessing a moment that would reshape family mythology. Uncle Tom recovered first, his face hardening into the expression he wore when construction crews challenged his authority. Sarah, I think you need to calm down and think about what you're doing here. You're embarrassing yourself and upsetting people who love you. The words were designed to shame her back into compliance, to activate the lifelong conditioning that made her responsible for everyone else's emotional comfort. But Sarah felt something different now, a clarity so sharp it was almost surgical. I'm embarrassing myself? Uncle Tom, I just spent 25 years exhausting myself trying to earn love from people who found my efforts annoying. If anyone should be embarrassed, it's all of you for letting me believe that was normal." Tom's eyes flashed with genuine anger now, the careful veneer of family patriarch cracking to reveal something uglier underneath. "You ungrateful little—" "Tom." David's voice cut through his brother's rising fury with surprising authority. "Don't finish that sentence." Sarah felt a flicker of surprise. Her adoptive father had never stood up to his older brother before, had never challenged the family hierarchy that kept Tom at the center and everyone else in careful orbit around his approval. "Don't what?" Tom turned on David with the full force of his frustration. "Don't point out that your daughter is having some kind of breakdown and taking it out on people who've done nothing but love her?" "Love her?" David's voice was quiet but sharp. "Is that what we've been doing?" The question hit like a slap. Sarah watched her father, this reserved, careful man who'd always chosen peace over conflict, finally find his courage at exactly the moment she'd found hers. Because looking back at the last 25 years, it seems like we've been asking her to earn something that should have been freely given. Maggie stepped closer to David, her face streaked with tears, but her voice growing stronger. "Tom, you made that comment about the Korean barbecue. I was standing right there when you dismissed something Sarah had worked so hard to share with us. It was just food preferences." "It was her heritage," Maggie said fiercely. "It was her trying to share something meaningful with us, and—" "You made her feel like she should apologize for having a culture that wasn't exactly the same as ours." Sarah felt something shift in her chest as she watched her parents finally defend her against the subtle cruelties they'd been witnessing for decades. Jake stepped forward, his face red with embarrassment and defensive anger. "Okay, so maybe Dad made some insensitive comments over the years. That doesn't mean Sarah gets to blow up our entire family because she can't handle some constructive criticism." "Constructive criticism?" Elena's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Sarah had almost forgotten her best friend was there, had been so focused on the family dynamics unfolding around her. "I'm sorry. Who are you exactly?" Linda asked, her voice dripping with dismissive superiority. "I'm Elena Rodriguez. I'm Sarah's best friend, and I've been watching you people treat her like shit for 8 years. The profanity landed like a physical blow in the careful world of Williams' family politeness. Linda's mouth fell open in shock. "I've watched Sarah come home from every family gathering looking like she'd spent the day auditioning for a role she wasn't sure she'd get to keep," Elena continued, her voice steady and implacable. "I've watched her exhaust herself trying to anticipate your needs and manage your emotions and prove she deserved to exist in your space." "That's completely unfair," Jake started. "Is it? When's the last time any of you called Sarah just to hear her voice? When's the last time you celebrated her achievements instead of minimizing them? When's the last time you made her feel like she was wanted instead of tolerated?" The questions hung in the air, and Sarah watched her family members exchange uncomfortable glances. She could see them trying to remember moments of pure, uncomplicated affection, searching for evidence that their love had been expressed as clearly as their conditions. "Sarah knows we love her," Linda said weakly. "Does she?" Elena's voice was relentless. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like she knows you love the version of herself she performs for you. The grateful adopted daughter who never asks for too much, never takes up too much space, never expects the same unconditional acceptance that everyone else in this family takes for granted." Sarah felt tears threatening, but these were different from the desperate tears she'd cried all week. These were tears of recognition, of finally hearing someone else see and name the dynamics she'd been swimming in for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe. "You want to know what constructive criticism looks like, Jake?" Elena turned her fierce attention to Sarah's cousin. Constructive criticism would have been saying, "Sarah, we appreciate your help, but we'd prefer to keep things more casual." Destructive criticism is calling someone the try-hard behind their back and then continuing to accept their labor while mocking their desperation to belong. Jake's face was crimson now, his usual charm completely abandoned. "You don't understand our family dynamics." "I understand perfectly. Your family dynamics include making one person responsible for everyone else's emotional comfort, while excluding her from the inner circle of real belonging." Sarah found her voice again, stronger now with Elena's fierce advocacy backing her up. Do you know what I did after every family gathering for the past 10 years? I went home and made lists. Lists of things I could have done better, conversations I could have handled differently, ways I could be more helpful next time. She looked around at the circle of faces, seeing some of them for the first time without the filter of desperate need for approval. I turned every family interaction into a performance review, where I was always falling short of some standard I couldn't quite identify. And you all let me do it because it was easier than examining why I felt like I had to. Sarah, Maggie's voice was broken, pleading. We never wanted you to feel that way. Then why didn't any of you notice that I did? Why didn't it occur to any of you that someone who worked that hard to belong might be working from a place of insecurity, rather than natural enthusiasm? Sarah felt the power of finally asking the questions she'd been carrying for 25 years. Why didn't it concern you that I never brought friends to family gatherings? Why didn't you wonder why I apologized for everything? Why didn't you think it was strange that I needed your approval for every major life decision? David stepped forward, his voice rough with emotion. Because we were cowards. Because it was easier to accept your gratitude than to examine whether you should have felt grateful in the first place. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Sarah looked at her adoptive father, this man who'd taught her to ride a bike and helped her with homework and walked her down the aisle at graduation, and felt her heart break a little for both of them. I should have protected you better, David continued. When Tom made those comments about your career, when Linda criticized your choices, when Jake excluded you from conversations, I should have said something. I should have made it clear that treating you as anything less than full family was unacceptable. But you didn't, Sarah said gently. You chose family peace over my dignity, and you taught me that my comfort was less important than everyone else's. Tom's voice cut through the moment with characteristic authority. This is getting completely out of hand. Sarah, you're 28 years old. If you've been feeling insecure about your place in this family, that's something you should have addressed directly instead of letting it build up into this kind of public drama. Sarah turned to face her uncle, this man whose approval she'd chased for 25 years, and felt the last vestiges of her need for his validation finally die. You're right, Uncle Tom. I should have addressed it directly. So let me do that now. She took a breath and felt Elena's hand squeeze her shoulder in support. Your construction business is not more valuable than my marketing career. Your definition of real work is not the only definition that matters. Your comfort with my gratitude is not more important than my right to exist authentically in this family. Tom's face was darkening with each word, but Sarah continued relentlessly. My adoption does not make me a perpetual guest in this family. My different appearance does not make me exotic decoration for your family photos. My heritage does not require your approval to be valid. Sarah. Linda tried to interrupt. I'm not finished, Aunt Linda. Your criticism of my appearance, my relationships, my life choices, all of it stops now. Your passive-aggressive comments, disguised as concern, stop now. Your expectation that I should be grateful for basic family inclusion stops now. Sarah felt something breaking open in her chest, not breaking apart, but breaking open like a flower that had been kept in darkness, finally reaching sunlight. And Jake. She turned to face her cousin directly. Your casual cruelty, your mockery of my efforts to connect, your assumption that I exist to make your life easier, all of it stops now. Jake's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he found his voice. You can't just come here and dictate terms to everyone. I'm not dictating terms. I'm setting boundaries. For the first time in my adult life, I'm telling you what I need instead of trying to guess what you want. And what if we can't give you what you need? Tom's voice was cold now, threatening. Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and felt the strangest sense of freedom. Then I'll know where I stand. And I'll stop wasting my energy, trying to earn something you were never planning to give freely. The silence that followed was different from the earlier tension. This silence felt final, like the moment when a door closes, and everyone recognizes that the conversation has ended, and something new has begun. Sarah looked around at her family, at 25 years of careful relationships and managed emotions, and performed gratitude, and felt herself letting go of all of it. Not with anger, exactly, not with hatred, but with the profound relief of someone who had finally stopped carrying a weight she'd never been meant to bear alone. "I'm going home now," she said quietly. "When any of you are ready to have a relationship with me based on who I actually am, rather than who you need me to be, you know where to find me." She turned to leave, Elena falling into step beside her, and behind them the Williams family reunion continued without its coordinator for the first time in 25 years. As they walked toward the parking lot, Sarah could hear the murmur of shocked conversations beginning, the careful reconstruction of family narrative around this unprecedented breach in the established order. She didn't look back. For the first time in her life, she was more interested in what lay ahead than in managing what she was leaving behind. Overheard Truths Part 10. New Foundations. 3 months later, Sarah stood in her transformed apartment, watching the late September sunlight stream through windows that no longer displayed perfect family photos in matching frames. The gallery wall had been replaced with art that spoke to her. Photographs from her recent trip to San Francisco's Chinatown. A painting she'd bought from a local artist whose work made her think of possibility. And yes, still some family photos, but different ones. Pictures where her smile looked genuine rather than grateful. Moments where she was laughing instead of performing. The apartment itself had evolved too. Gone were the sterile perfection and carefully coordinated colors. In their place was warmth, books stacked on tables, plants in various stages of thriving, a kitchen counter that showed signs of actual cooking rather than display. It looked like a place where someone lived rather than a showroom designed to impress visitors who rarely came. Elena was due to arrive any minute for their weekly dinner, and Sarah found herself actually looking forward to it in a way that felt foreign. When had she last anticipated something without simultaneously planning every detail of how it would unfold? The reunion had been a watershed moment, but not in the dramatic way she'd expected. There had been no tearful reconciliations or grand gestures of apology. Instead, there had been a slow, careful sorting of relationships into categories she was still learning to recognize. Those worth preserving, those requiring boundaries, and those that had perhaps never been real to begin with. Her phone buzzed, with a text from Marcus. "Coffee tomorrow still on? I have news." They'd been rebuilding their friendship carefully over the past 2 months. Tentative conversations that had gradually deepened into something approaching the emotional intimacy they'd once shared. Sarah had done the work he'd asked her to do. Not to win him back, but because she'd finally understood that she deserved to know who she was, without the constant performance of worthiness. The discovery had been both terrifying and liberating. Without the exhausting job of managing everyone else's emotions, Sarah had found energy for things she'd forgotten she enjoyed. She'd started taking Mandarin classes, curious about the language her birth father might have spoken. She'd joined a hiking group, discovered she loved the solitude of trails and the satisfaction of physical challenge that had nothing to do with pleasing anyone else. She'd even started therapy, finally ready to examine the patterns that had shaped her for 25 years. Her therapist, Dr. Kim, had used a phrase that had stuck with her. "You've been living in a state of chronic emotional vigilance." The idea that her hyper-awareness of others' feelings, her constant monitoring of family dynamics, her desperate need to fix problems before they arose, all of it was trauma response, not personality trait. The doorbell rang, and Sarah opened it to find Elena holding a bottle of wine and wearing the kind of smile that suggested good news. "You look different," Elena said, studying Sarah's face as she stepped into the apartment. Calmer. "I feel different. Like I'm finally living in my own life instead of auditioning for someone else's." They settled into Sarah's kitchen, and Elena poured wine while Sarah finished preparing dinner. A simple pasta dish that she'd made because she enjoyed cooking, not because she was trying to impress anyone. "So," Elena said, settling into her chair with obvious satisfaction, "tell me about the Maggie situation." Sarah's relationship with her adoptive parents had been the most complex to navigate. Unlike Uncle Tom, who had responded to the reunion, confrontation with wounded dignity and radio silence, or Jake, who seemed to be waiting for Sarah to apologize for embarrassing him, Maggie and David had surprised her. "Mom called yesterday," Sarah said, twirling pasta around her fork. "She's been going to therapy too." "Really?" "Really. She said she wanted to understand why she'd been so afraid of conflict that she'd let me suffer rather than confront the family dynamics that were hurting me. Elena raised her eyebrows. That's actually pretty insightful. It is. And she asked if I'd be willing to do some family sessions with her and Dad, to learn how to have a different kind of relationship. How do you feel about that? Sarah considered the question. 3 months ago, she would have immediately said yes, desperate to repair any crack in family relationships. Now she found herself weighing her own emotional capacity against the potential benefits. Cautiously optimistic. They're doing the work, you know? They're not just asking me to forgive and forget. They're trying to understand how their choices affected me. That's huge. It is. Dad even called Uncle Tom last week. Told him that if he wanted to maintain a relationship with our family, he needed to examine his behavior toward me and make some changes. Elena nearly choked on her wine. David did that? I know. I almost didn't believe it when Mom told me. But apparently, Dad has been carrying guilt about not protecting me for years, and the reunion was his wake-up call. Sarah felt a complicated mix of emotions when she thought about her parents' newfound courage. Gratitude that they were finally willing to prioritize her well-being over family harmony. Sadness that it had taken 25 years and a public confrontation to get there. And underneath it all, a tentative hope that they might actually build something authentic together. What about Jake? Sarah's expression grew more guarded. Jake. He sent me a text last month asking when I was going to stop punishing everyone for one overheard conversation. Jesus. Yeah, I blocked his number after that. I realized I was still waiting for him to understand what he'd done. Wrong, but some people aren't capable of that kind of self-reflection. The recognition had been painful but ultimately liberating. Sarah had spent weeks waiting for Jake to acknowledge the cruelty of his words, to recognize how his casual dismissals had shaped her entire relationship with the family. But Jake lived in a world where he was the wronged party, where Sarah's refusal to continue enabling his behavior was an attack on his character rather than a boundary around hers. Elena reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. I'm proud of you for letting that go. It's still hard sometimes. I catch myself wanting to fix it, to find a way to make him understand. But I'm learning that my need for his understanding is different from my need for his acceptance, and I don't actually need either one to live a full life. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, and Sarah marveled at how different this felt from the family dinners of her past. No undercurrents of tension, no careful monitoring of emotional temperature, no desperate need to keep everyone happy, just two friends enjoying each other's company. Oh, Elena said suddenly. I almost forgot. My mom wants to invite you to Thanksgiving. Sarah felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, quickly followed by curiosity about the anxiety itself. What did you tell her? I told her I'd ask you. No pressure, no guilt if you're not ready. But she said she's been wanting to meet the woman who finally learned to stand up for herself. The idea of spending Thanksgiving with Elena's large, loud, unfiltered family both terrified and intrigued Sarah. No careful choreography, no performance of gratitude, no walking on eggshells around fragile egos, just chaos and warmth and the kind of love that didn't require earning. I think I'd like that, Sarah said, surprising herself. As Elena helped her clean up after dinner, Sarah found herself thinking about the reunion again. Not with the sting of humiliation she'd carried for weeks afterward, but with something approaching gratitude. That horrible, necessary conversation had destroyed the careful fiction she'd been living in, but it had also cleared the ground for something real to grow. Her phone buzzed with a text from her therapist. Looking forward to our session this week. Remember to bring the family photos you mentioned. Dr. Kim had asked her to bring pictures from different stages of her life, not just the careful family portraits, but candid shots, moments when she'd forgotten to perform. They were working on helping Sarah recognize the difference between who she'd been taught to be and who she actually was underneath all the trying. It was slow work, sometimes painful work. But for the first time in her adult life, Sarah was more interested in discovering herself than in managing everyone else's opinion of her. Elena hugged her goodbye at the door, and Sarah stood in her transformed apartment, listening to the sounds of Chicago evening settling around her. Tomorrow she would have coffee with Marcus, hear his news, continue the careful process of rebuilding trust between them. This weekend she would visit her parents for the first time since the reunion, ready to begin the complicated work of forging an authentic relationship with the people who'd raised her. And next month, she would spend Thanksgiving with people who wanted her there simply because they enjoyed her company, not because she made their lives easier. Sarah Chen-Williams was finally learning what it felt like to be loved for who she was instead of what she could provide. And for the first time in 25 years, that felt like enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.